which the second half of the century is really the key thing. And yet, as you're going to see, there are going to remain elements of the British economy that seem a long way from industrial forms of production. Now, as you can see from these figures, the index of industrial production is simply to illustrate the fact that by far the largest leap in terms of the scale of industrial production is in the second half of the 19th century. Okay? I mean, it's a massive, massive leap from 1851 to 1913, as opposed, to a significant doubling between 1800 and 1851. Okay, but a significant leap forward in the second half of the 19th century. And you can see that reflected also in the figures for the production of iron, steel, and coal. Because it's really iron, steel, and coal that form the backbone of industrial forms of production. I don't want you, however, to think that by 1913 all Britons are busily at work in engineering factories, okay? Because that just isn't the case. Very nice sly entry. In 1898, the average size of the workshop in Britain employed just 30 people, okay? So not everyone is working in massive, large-scale factories. Indeed, by 1907, only 100 firms had a workforce of 3,000 or more. Okay? So in fact, the types of large-scale industrial factory production that we're talking about remain remarkably small as a percentage of the workforce. That represents those 100 firms with 3,000 employees represent something like 5% of the total workforce. Okay, so not a big deal. Now, railways were obviously a key part of the acceleration of industrialization in the second half of the 19th century. And again, you remember that railways really begin in the 1830s, but it's really from the 1850s that the scale of Britain's industrial network, transportation network, grows exponentially. And with it comes the increasing mobility of labour. That's what passengers are doing. Not all passengers are going off on a nice day trip to the seaside. Most of them are getting a ride to work and back every morning. And these figures of the growth of the rail network in Britain could, of course, also be mapped by the growth of the rail network in the US, in Latin America, in Russia, in India, almost all of which was financed by British capital. Okay? So the growth of a rail network that enables the transmission of goods across vast distances is a very important part of this process of industrialization. But again, I don't want you to think that everybody is reclining in a third or fourth class railway carriage on their way to work. Okay? Horses continue to play an absolutely central role in British economic life. In the 1890s, there's estimated to be something like 300,000 horses still working in London alone. Okay? That's an awful lot of horse manure to get out of the capital. That's one horse for every 15 people. Okay? And they're involved not just in taking people on carriages, they're actually involved in the movement of goods across the capital. Shipping. Okay? You can get stuff around the country in railways, but you have to get them abroad in ships. And here the key story is about, again, the acceleration of the speed of shipping, the shrinking of the world into a, if you like, a tradable scale where goods could be transferred across continents cheaply and quickly enough. So the introduction of steam technology in shipping is very, very important. And you can see again, that's something that happens in the second half of the 19th century. 5% in 1850, 5% of steam ships, 5% of ships are steam powered in 1850, 50% by 1903. That means that there's still an awful lot of sail power being used. Okay? That sail power is, however, primarily being used for coastal trade. That is, moving goods down the coastline in Britain, maybe going over to France or to Scandinavia. But the long intercontinental journeys were primarily, well, almost all done by steam. And you can see that reflected in the thousands of tons worth of goods on the bottom set of figures. By 1900, the British Merchant Navy, the shipping fleet, is carrying a third of the world's total tonnage. Okay? Now, in part, that was a consequence of the Navigation Acts that had been repealed in 1849, remember, that had established the monopoly of British shipping across much of the world. But it continues even half a century afterwards to dominate the transportation of goods across the world. A third of world tonnage. Now, however, okay, so I'm up to this point giving you a sense of the increasing dynamism, the increasing growth of the British economy domestically. Now we begin to confront the reality that all of a sudden there are other countries who are growing, whose industrial power is growing just as fast. And really the key competitors at this point, in the second half of the 19th century, is the USA and Germany. And Britain is effectively displaced by the USA in terms of its percentage of manufacturing capacity by the turn of the century. Okay. Anyone need me to go back over all of that before I start talking about agriculture? $1900. 1900, carrying a third of the world's tonnage. Was that a helicopter? There's not another occupation, is there? Right, let's talk about agriculture. Now, you'll remember that one of the reasons why the Corn Laws had been so contentious was because the agricultural sector was associated with the aristocratic landed interest of Britain. Okay? And the Corn Laws were seen to be protecting the interests of those aristocracy. Now, land in Britain continues to be totally monopolized by the aristocracy. And you can see that in 1871, 7,500 owners owned over 50% of the land, but the vast majority of that was owned by just 3,000 families who had possessed that land since 1700. Okay, it's a very small elite group of landowners in Britain, and it continues to be so even down through the late 20th century. Moreover, as you should already be aware, because I've been going on about this, the connection to land was very important in terms of monopolizing the political process. So 80% of MPs continue to have landed connections in 1871. That left really remarkably little land that was farmed by owner-occupiers. Just 15% of land was farmed by owner-occupiers. Many, and some of that 15% is also farmed by tenant farmers, tenants of the great landed estates. Okay, so a very small percentage of British agriculture is based around small-scale owner-occupied farming. Most of it is in these big agricultural estates. Last thing I want to say here, which is why I have this picture of the Rothschild estate in Buckinghamshire up here. One of the things that happens increasingly in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, is that people who made their money by other means, like finance capitalism or manufacturing industry, increasingly wanted to buy into the prestige of owning land and of having an estate. Okay, so many people, like the Rothschilds, build these type of buildings and acquire the land around them so that they can be the country gentleman, so that they can ape the aristocracy of old, because they know that that's basically where the status comes from. So this seemingly, archaic building is actually a product of built in the 1870s, and there are many other examples of great Gothic castles that manufacturing titans build in the countryside. So what happens to agriculture in the last quarter of the 19th century is not a process of political reform. Okay? There isn't a big land reform campaign to try and free up land from this aristocratic monopoly. Whenever Britain colonizes another country, one of the first things it does is introduce land reform, okay, to try and bring the land into the open market. Okay? In Britain, that absolutely never occurred because of the political power of the landed interest. So what happens in the last quarter of the 19th century is the cause of agricultural decline comes from global economic pressures, and particularly the collapse of commodity prices. A whole series of things come as a consequence of the collapse of those commodity prices. First, more and more land is taken out of production because it just isn't worth cultivating it for the lower price that you're reaching on the market. So 2.5 million acres fall out of production between 1870 and 1911. The second is because that land is now making less money, generating less income, rental values fall quite dramatically. So rental values fall by 20%. You're getting less money for the rental of your land to tenants and tenant farmers. Land values fall even more dramatically by 50%. So suddenly the value of these great estates is effectively halved. And this is happening at the same time that commercial urban property prices is rising very dramatically at 300% over the same period. All of these figures span 1870.